So this teaching is going to be a little bit different format than what you're used to concerning and from me. Anytime prior to this you've ever heard a teaching of mine online, it's been a teaching that's been done at Homestead Heights Community Church in Fort Smith. Here I am sitting in my living room. My wife is asleep in our bedroom. Our daughter is asleep behind me in her bedroom. And our son is in Little Rock away. So while everybody's asleep, I decided I would go ahead and play around with this. And like I said, do a recording of a teaching I did at Kingdom Builders Church in South Oklahoma a couple Wednesday nights ago. And so as we kind of move into this, do these things, a lot of my teachings in the future will probably be similar, if not same to this, be recordings at my home. There's some individual studies that I've done, and hopefully it's something that you can kind of tune in to enjoy. Any and all questions, comments, or rebuttals are welcome, as I will mention at the end of this as well. So thank you for taking the time aside. Thank you so much, and here we go. So in typical normal fashion, as is for me, that's like way after the teaching, I finally come up with what I feel is the perfect name for it, which is laughter from the hand of God. And again, I want us to take a look at the story of Abraham and the story of Isaac and kind of turn it on its head a little bit, because it's one of the stories that if you are inside church, if you've been around church and you've listened to a lot of the Bible stories, whether it be Sunday school, whether it be Sunday morning messages, it's familiar with a lot of people. And I've actually heard it referred to as kind of a sore spot or perhaps a black eye for some individuals because of the content that's in it. And again, I feel if we could take a look at some of the finer details in this, we might find some surprising details within the scripture itself. And a question I want to pose here right now, and this may be something you're familiar with, this may be something you've never thought of before, but where is the first time love is ever mentioned in Scripture? And the reason why I ask that question is whenever people hear the word love and they hear Bible, one of the very first things they think of is John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Really, we're going to take a look at the very first place the word love is ever mentioned, and perhaps not surprisingly, given what we know about John 3:16, the very first time love is ever mentioned in Scripture is in reference to the love that a father has towards his son. More on that a little bit later. As always, one of my favorite chapters in the entire Bible, it's actually Luke chapter 24. And this is after the crucifixion of Christ. This is after his resurrection. This is where he starts revealing and showing himself to different disciples and different individuals. I believe Paul said it was over 500 witnesses. And one of the things that it says he had done, he was on the Emmaus Road when he shown himself to a couple of the disciples. He said that he actually started speaking with them, and he actually opened the scriptures to them, showing where he could be found in the law and where he could be found in the prophets. A little bit later on in the same chapters, he revealed himself to more of the core disciples, and he actually showed him where he could be found in the law and the prophets, and also the writings. So I want us to use that insight that you can't find Jesus just in the Gospels in and of themselves, but the whole narrative in the entire Old Testament, it has examples and templates with individuals and characters that help kind of paint an outline of who we are to expect, or who we were to expect later on through this. And to me, this story, this binding of Isaac, what is known as in Hebrew the Akedah, this is a prime example of one of those things that we will take a look at. And there's a word I want us to take a look at that you will find several times from Genesis 17 up until the birth of Isaac, and it's one of my favorite words. If you see me on Facebook, you'll probably find it probably pretty true. It's one of my favorite words, and the word is laughter. And to me, in my opinion, there's at least two different ways or two different reasons a person may laugh. One might be that somebody finds something humorous, something silly, and it kind of resonates with the individual, so naturally they'll have laughter. Another reason somebody may laugh is because they're kind of scoffing at an idea, something they find somewhat preposterous. And I feel like in these handful of chapters, we find different individuals who laugh for both reasons. The reason I say that is if you take a look at Genesis 17 through 19, it says, "Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? And shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, Oh, that Ishmael may live before you. Then God said, No, Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his descendants after him." Whenever you take a look at this, Genesis, I believe it's 22, later on, as God tells Abraham, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains in which I tell you." A lot of people take issue with that because if literally you read Genesis 17 through 19 like we did, it talks about Ishmael. Well, keep in mind, who is Ishmael? Now, Ishmael is the son of Abraham through the handmaid Hagar. One of the things I find pretty interesting, and a question I love to ask individuals whenever we take a look at these portions of Scripture together in these stories, how and why is Ishmael a factor even at all in the narrative of Scripture? Well, we know, if you read the narrative, that God had promised Abraham a son. And Sarah, she recognizes what's going on by natural everyday science. As old as she is, as old as he is, the both of them together, she's past her prime. She's past being able to naturally be able to conceive, to give birth. And so if there's any way possible whatsoever, Abraham's going to have to go a different route. And if she knows through Abraham that Abraham was actually going to be able to be the father of many nations like God had told him, she didn't consider herself to be a part of that picture. And as was the custom in the East, she gave her handmaid to Abraham. Now the question I like to ask people, what age was Abraham when Ishmael was born? One of the things I find interesting about and love about the Hebrew language and some of the ancient concepts about it is their alphabet. It serves not only as like a character system for different letters, but every Hebrew letter also functions as a quantity or a numerical value. For example, the first letter, Aleph, equals 1. Bet, the second letter, equals 2. Yud, the 10th letter, equals 10. It goes 1 through 10. And 10 through 100 by increments of 10, and then 100, 200, 300, 400. So if Abraham was 86 years old, how do you get 86? Well, mathematically, you take 80 plus 6. Well, if you take a look at the letter that equals 80, you come to the letter that is Peh. Now, what's interesting about Peh is that it's also a word. Hebrew letters are also words, as weird as that may kind of sound to English listeners. The word Peh, if you're hearing my voice right now, it's because my voice is coming out of my mouth. Peh literally in Hebrew means mouth. And then you have the number 6. If you take a look at the significance of the number 6 in Scripture, what happened on day 6? What was the big deal in creation on day 6? Well, it was actually the day that Scripture says in Genesis that man was created. So I find it interesting that if you include the mouth being number 80 and 6 being the day that man was created according to Genesis, Ishmael only came as a result of the mouth of mankind. Sarah knew in her heart, she totally believed that she wasn't going to be able to give Abraham an offspring. So in order to help fulfill that promise and her understanding from her mouth, she suggested to Abraham, hey, why don't you take Hagar and have a child with her through her? And I just kind of figured that's one of the fascinating things, that whenever you start learning a lot of the Hebrew language and some of the numbers, you can actually start pairing letter meanings and numerical values and find a lot of intriguing details. And I kind of figured that would be worth sharing here, as I did a couple Wednesday nights ago, back at the end of June. But taking a look at the word laughter, talking about these letters having numerical value. We even touched base with it earlier with Genesis 17, that Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was 90. If there would be any way possible in my mind that life could come from a 100-year-old and a 90-year-old, we would have to say that it would definitely be from the hand of God, because that's not something you would naturally ever see. And so I want us to take a little bit of time. We see in Genesis 17 through 19, where Abraham laughed. Well, you also go looking a little bit further on in Genesis 18, it talks about Sarah laughed as well. And then you read later on, after Isaac's been born in Genesis 21 verse 6, that Sarah, she laughs again, but it's for a different purpose. And she even says that everyone's going to laugh with them, because when she laughed later on in Genesis 18, it was almost more like a scoff, like, seriously, how is that going to be something even remotely possible that I'll be able to have Isaac? I just don't see, I don't understand. But then later on, whenever you see that Isaac's been born, that laughter actually has a heart behind it, that she actually feels fulfilled within her laughter. And one of the things I brought up, and I always love to bring up, when you take a look at the patriarchs in the book of Genesis, you have Abraham, you have Isaac, and you have Jacob. There's something that stands unique among Isaac that is different than his father or even his son. And it's the fact that the name Isaac, who does Scripture say actually named Isaac? Now, you will see later on where it says Abraham called him Isaac, but it was because he was told by God to name his child Isaac. And so when it comes to the name, why am I saying there's a difference? Why am I saying there's a significance there? Well, in Scripture, was Abraham always Abraham? Abraham was actually Abram whenever he fathered Ishmael. Then you move up a little bit further into time, you have Isaac, who he wasn't really ever known as another name. And then you see his son Jacob, who was later rechristened in Scripture as Israel. So I find it interesting that not only is Isaac always his name, but we find in Scripture that it was God who said to name him Isaac. I think there's a lot that can be said there, especially when you get into the topic of names later in the book of Revelation. But as of now, for me, that's just a theory. It's not something I'm going to add in here to sidetrack myself on, because Lord knows I'm very bad about that. So whose idea was it to name this promised child Isaac? In Scripture, it says it was God. By the fact that God named Isaac, we know there's going to be special things concerning this child. And as a matter of fact, Isaac is the only patriarch to not have his name changed. And like I said, for thousands of years, not just something, they've decided recently in my lifetime, or even in the lifetime of my grandparents or great-great-great-grandparents. But for thousands of years, the letters of the Hebrew alphabet also functioned as quantities. They function as numbers. And if you take a look at the word laughter in Hebrew, it's zakok, and it means laughter, to laugh. And it also has the meaning of possibly to scoff. So it's just kind of a neat little note. And so you find in Genesis 17 that Abraham found himself laughing at the idea of that he was going to be a father, and, Sarah was going to accompany him at that. Then we see Sarah in Genesis 18, as I mentioned. She laughed. And then once the fulfillment of Isaac actually came into the world, Sarah had laughter again, but it was for a whole other purpose that I mentioned, that it was her heart that was behind the laughter now. And even said that everyone's going to laugh with them. Well, if you take a look at the word laugh in Hebrew, it's 3 letters. And it's the letter Zadi, it's the letter Ket, and it's the letter Kuf. Well, if you take a look at that first letter, Zadi, I tell people a lot of the time Zadi looks like the letter Y with a bent knee. And its numerical value is 90. Moving forward to the second letter, Ket, It's the 8th letter of the alphabet, and its numerical value is 8. And then you move to the final letter, the Kuf. It's actually 100 in numeric value. So what about all this in my mind is worth us actually taking a look at these 3 separate numbers, or these 3 separate letters and their numeric value? Well, what's the significance in the story of the number 90? Well, the number 90 is the age of Sarah when Isaac was born. Well, what about the last letter, with it being Kuf and its numerical value being 100? What in the world is so significant about that? Well, the significance to 100 is the fact that that's how old Abraham was when Isaac was born. And the middle letter, number 8, what's the significance about number 8? Well, to this story in particular, you start taking a look at the details that are mentioned in the narrative. It actually says that this child, that Isaac, he was commanded to be circumcised on the 8th day. And the number 8 in Scripture, it actually has a reputation to go along with it as being the number of life or new life. What examples may you ask? Well, take a look at the flood narrative with Noah. How many people were aboard the ark whenever the flood had taken place? Well, you have Noah himself, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, his 3 sons, and all 4 of their respective wives. 8 people were spared in the flood. You take a look at the number of sons of Jesse. Who was Jesse, may you ask? Well, Jesse was the father of 8 sons, the youngest being King David. I've also told people before as well, if you take a look at what day of the week was it that Jesus rose from the dead, it would have been, if you include the Passion Week, the 8th day. And so it's the number of life, or new life. And I just find it unique that book ended on the word laughter. You have 90, the age of Sarah. You have 100, the age of Abraham. And between the 90 and 100-year-old comes new life. And I've always found that kind of fascinating. And to me, taking a look at Scripture, if there is any way possible that between new life coming from a 90 and 100-year-old, how would that be possible? And to me, it would just simply be the hand of God. Something I find unique is mentioning all the letters having numerical values. There is a letter in the Hebrew called Yud. Now, Yud, it's the 10th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and Yud actually means hand. And I kind of find it fascinating because you take a look at your hands, and majority of the people who would take a listen to this, they have 10 fingers on their hand. July 4th was a couple of days ago, so that might have changed for a certain amount of individuals who could hear this. And what I find interesting about this letter, with it representing 10, the number of fingers people have on their hand and everything else, and of course the word Yud meaning hand, me saying that the only way that new life could come from Sarah, who's 90, and Abraham, who's 100, is through the hand of God. And if you take a look at the number 10 in Scripture, you find it a couple of times, even in Exodus. You have the 10 commandments on Sinai. Not too long before that, you also have the 10 signs, plagues, and wonders of Egypt, starting with the Nile turning to blood, and then you also have the death of the firstborn. Go back to Genesis, even. You take a look in Genesis, the 6-7 days of creation, where everything was created with the 10 utterances. And if you take a look at Genesis 22, you find what is known in a lot of writings, the final of the 10 trials of Abraham, that there were 10 things that he had went through by the time his faith was fully tested. If you take that letter that means 10, that Yud, and you put it in front of the word Zakak, which again, Zakak, it means laughter. If you put that letter that means hand in front of that, it becomes Yitzchak, the name Isaac. You literally put the letter that means hand and the word that means hand in front of laughter, and you get the name of Isaac. Thus the title for this message, Laughter from the Hand of God. And so that was on the pass outs that I handed everybody at Kingdom Builders Assembly of God in Sallisaw. And so with that being said, I want us to take a look at some details in Genesis 22. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and start reading and make some little stops here and there. To me, things that kind of build blueprint or kind of an outline of what we find later on in the Greek scriptures in the New Testament. Starting in Genesis 22, verse 1. Now it came to pass that after these things, that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains in which I shall tell you. A couple of things I want us to take a look at here is, first off, a question. I want you to kind of think to yourself, how old was Isaac when all this transpired? You know, we don't see at the beginning of the chapter where it just jumps straight ahead and says, hey, he's X and X amount of age, this is how old he was, and FYI, here's some information in your back pocket. Now, I've seen movies or films, I have seen and listened to sermons where he was single-digit age and up to like 13, maybe 14 years old. And maybe the reason why they think it was 14, that's how old Ishmael was whenever Isaac would have been born to Abraham. Again, that might be reading too much or giving some folks too much credit on why they have that number. And to me, I don't agree with that number. And I remember being really bad about in times past about reading so many extra biblical books. I'm not talking about like Apocrypha or anything like that nature, but I was really bad about reading commentaries, but not reading the Bible itself as much as I did other commentaries. And it was just a conviction of mine that eventually I would have to kind of key in and settle down and learn to use the Bible as commentary on itself, as opposed to getting all of my knowledge from outside books. And again, this isn't like some sort of call for me to tell people like, hey, you need to go burn, all your commentaries and do the whole sola scriptura and only scripture and this and that. It was just a conviction of mine to start using scripture more as the absolute foundation of everything. And that being said, if we were to take a look at this, read this chapter and read the beginning of the next one, and I believe we could come to Isaac's more exact age. We'll get to that part later, but a couple of the things I want us to look at here. It says that go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains in which I tell you. I don't have a lot of qualms with using the term burnt offering. I know there's a lot of people who have a lot of misconceptions as to what a lot of those are. When it came to a burnt offering, what was put on the fire? What was going to be left? There wasn't going to be anything left, and for there to be a fire of that magnitude, it would require a good amount of wood. It wouldn't be something that, you'd be roasting marshmallows and hot dogs over. It would actually have to be a decent amount of wood. And so later on, whenever we read about having to bind the wood to Isaac, and Isaac himself being bound to the wood, it would have to be a pretty substantial amount. And if that were to be accurate, how would a child who would be single-digit age or even a young teenager be able to handle such a vast amount of resources to climb up a mountainside or up a hillside? And again, that's one thing there. And it talks about the land of Moriah. You take a look at that word, and it's what I call in Hebrew a coin word. Again, I don't think anybody else that I know of or I've ever heard of calls it that. But Hebrew's kind of multifaceted as far as there's several words that can hold not just a single meaning, but two, maybe three. And Moriah is one of them where when I was doing my research on this, however long ago it was, it said that it had up to three potential meanings that they knew of. One of them is Moriah, shall be seen, God shall be seen. And they also think that it could mean bitterness of God, thinking that it comes from, etymology-wise, from the word Morah. And I think that's something that's kind of neat because, in this context of Scripture, whenever, Abraham's being told, take your son Isaac and give him as a burnt offering, yeah, that would leave a bitter spot in a lot of people's mouths because that's a hardship. It really, truly is. But again, I want us to delve a little bit deeper into this and take a look at the story in a little bit greater detail. If Scripture were to take it for what it says, Abraham would have absolutely believed. He had 100 years before the birth of this child to fester on this promise that God was going to make him a father of many nations. And when Ishmael's in the picture, he's like, no, you don't understand me. You yourself are going to have a child with your wife. And if Abraham knew that to be an absolute promise from God and of God, that if something were to happen to him on top of this mountain, and Abraham knew that this was the promised child, that God wouldn't have lied to him, take a look at the stipulations that were laid out before whenever the covenant was made earlier on, a few handful of chapters prior in Genesis. Abraham would have absolutely known God to have been true about this. And if something were to happen to Isaac and he would die, but God made the promise that this would have been the son, that to me is a hint alone in and of itself of resurrection. Again, Jesus revealed to his disciples in Luke 24 all the places in the law, in the prophets, in the writings where he could be found, where this topic of resurrection would be found. And bear in mind, even Jesus' words himself said, if they don't believe Moses, they're not going to believe me. Jesus reiterated several times that what we find, what would be later known in the context of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the Gospels, this isn't something he came up with on its own. This was something that was expected through the Scriptures themselves, through the prophets themselves, and even in the songs and the writings. And so just stuff to keep in mind with Moriah. So it could mean bitterness of God, but it also means God could be seen. Picking back up in verse 3. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son. And he split the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place in which God had told him. Then on the 3rd day Abraham lifted his eyes, and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey, and the lad and I will go up yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. And to me, in these 3 verses or however many that we just read here, there's a lot of things here, a lot of elements, a lot of details, verbiage, phraseology that to me you find peppered into the Greek scriptures themselves and everything from Matthew onwards. There's a donkey talking about a journey. Whenever I believe it's Jesus is coming up from Jericho in the Passover week, or the Passion Week, however you want to phrase that. Look at that. I might have be a little bit incorrect on one of those. You have him journeying up with the donkey. It talks about how blood covenants earlier in Genesis. Talks about how God had made a blood covenant with Abraham and made it unilaterally. God put Abraham in a deep sleep, and God passed through the gauntlet of sacrifices on himself, meaning that this whole covenant is going to rely on God himself. And I find that of special significance, all things considered, because whenever somebody would make a blood covenant in the East, they would put these with people who would be considered equals. And Trumbull, there's a book by, I think it's Henry Trumbull, and I believe the book is called Blood Covenant. I've got it in my library across the room over here I'm looking at. Gavin has a shark toy hanging on my bookshelf, and it's covering that book over there. So I can't run over and grab it real quick just for the sake of the recording. But he even mentions in his book that there are people who would do blood sacrifices and who would do the blood covenants, rather, they would be considered equals. And if we're to take that understanding and apply it here, we have someone who is almost not equal to God necessarily, because I know that sounds quite preposterous, but somebody who God was willing to call a friend. And then we have the promised son, who is Isaac, and two other people being seen on a mountain, on a place where it says that God or Yah shall be seen. Like we see in the Gospels, we have Jesus riding on the donkey. We see him later on whenever he's crucified, making his way up a mountainside, carrying his own burden to two other men. And it says here, stay here with the donkey, and the lad and I will go up yonder and worship. We come back to you. Verse 6, so Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the two of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham his father, and said, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. Then he said, look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, my son, God will provide himself for the lamb for a burnt offering. So the two of them went together. Then they came to the place in which God had told him. And Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order, and he bound Isaac his son and laid him up on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. Something I want us to take a look at here. Earlier I asked you to kind of think to yourself if you've ever thought or heard of this story before. How old was Isaac? What age was he when all this were to transpire? And again, I know in a lot of cinematic portrayals of the story, they make him to be this young child, single-digit age, as old as up to 14. And this is where I feel it's important for people who read this book and people who know this book. We really need to examine closely a lot of the things that it says, because this is something that we've got to take a look at. I truly feel that for us as believers and individuals who teach this book, preach this book, believe this book, however you want to phrase it, however you want to look at it, I feel that we need to be mature in our faith, and I feel like we need to be seasoned in a lot of the context of Scripture, And I remember people who know me and know my history and all of my speakings and stuff. I made a friend back in 2008, and it just kind of became funny how our dynamic and our friendship kind of bloomed and blossomed. He would play guitar. His name's Jonathan, and he's phenomenal when it comes to playing guitar and being able to sing. And he was there the morning that I preached my first sermon back October 12, 2008. And it kind of turned into this thing, the places that he would sing at, he would be able to get me in to start speaking there. And there's a lot of places where I would be able to speak at that I was able to get him there and sing as well. So it kind of was we kind of joked a little bit in time that it was like our own little ministry, that we would help each other to get in and share just some of the things of our life and what we've witnessed in the faith, and it was a really cool thing. And there's a song that Jonathan plays that's called Mighty to Save, and I think it was made famous by Matt Redman. And in that song, there is a line that says, I have given my life to follow everything I believe in, and I surrender all. And I kind of started thinking, for so many people, what is going to be the benefit that if we step into the other side of eternity and all we know how to do is halfway be able to quote John 3:16 and be able to say that I know how to say and sing all the verses of Amazing Grace? It might be a little generous to think this, but I believe that God has given me at least a halfway functional and developed brain. And having that thought and having the time opportunities that I have living in the country that I live, where I have this freedom to not be persecuted for reading this book, if the only two things I can say about my faith on the other side is I know how to say John 3:16 and sing Amazing Grace, I don't think I would have lived up to my aptitude of what Christ would have wanted by surrendering his life as a sacrifice. And so at that point, I was already a believer. Don't get me wrong, I've been a believer for several years, not even been preaching the word. But it became more emphatic to me at that point on to really buckle down and know my context and know the material. Because to me, to love the Word made flesh is to also love the written Word. And to love the written Word is to love the Word made flesh. And this is getting back to where I said allowing the Bible to be a commentary to itself. We don't have at the start of this chapter how old Isaac was. But if we were to take the flow of this narrative in the next couple chapters as happening kind of congruently and kind of in an ebb and flow, you start looking at the next chapter in Genesis 23, it's the death of Sarah, it's the death of Isaac's mother. And it says that she died at 127 years of age. Well, if she died at 127, and we've reiterated at this point several times that she was 90 years old at the time of Isaac's birth, that leaves us with an age of approximately 37 years old. And a question I have here is this. If Sarah was 127 on her death, and this were to happen approximately there, and Abraham was 10 years older than her, we have this individual who is in their 30s coming up against a man who would be in his 140s, I dare say. Think about that. Somebody who would be in the prime of their life to be put on an altar and to be bound on an altar, that would have to take their ultimate and complete submission. Because, to me, I'm literally 30 right now as we record this. Most 80, 90-year-olds probably wouldn't be that big of a problem for me to have to face if we were to get in an altercation and I had to defend myself. And so we know that this story, this binding of Isaac, this Akedah, it's almost praised Abraham as being the hero for being willing to give his son to God in this manner. But I think it should be every bit as much looked at as the willingness of Isaac to lay his life down to complete the will of the Father. Bring that over to the Gospels. Bring that over to Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, where Jesus himself said that I willingly lay my life down. No greater love does a man have to lay his life down for another. And so these are elements of things I'm thinking of as I read this story. What I also find interesting too is there are Jewish commentaries that I've come across that they actually make a lot of references to this binding of Isaac. If somebody was an Orthodox Jew and they were to do their daily prayers from what is known as the Siddur, the one prayer that they would pray every single day that would be based on Scripture, that would be based on an event or a narrative in the Bible and the Torah itself, it's actually the Akedah. And this is something I tell people, of all things to God, for God to impress on the hearts of those who orchestrated and put in order, the Siddur, why would it be this story? Every day they come to a story of a son willing to lay his life down for the will of the Father. And again, that's just something for me to kind of throw out there and think about. Verse 11, it says, "But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. So he said, Here I am. And he said, Do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram, offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place, The Lord Will Provide, as it is said to this day, In the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." Something I find intriguing as far as the Hebrew text of this is concerned when it talks about the topic of a ram caught in the thicket. The way that it's used in Hebrew, I believe it's ha'ayil. This is something I did a study on a few years ago, back when I was preaching at Homestead. You take the 4 letters that comprise the ram in Hebrew, those four letters could actually be taken a look at and arranged as two of the most simplistic names of God used in Hebrew, Yah and El. And this could be something I'm reading a little bit further into, but I find it fascinating that you have two names of God that can be seen in this event, or in what became the substitute sacrifice. And so to me, it's like there's one here and now, and then again, God shall be seen, Moriah, and there's almost a sense of it's going to be seen later on as well. Now, you move on a little bit forward to the conclusion of this chapter. Who is it that comes down from the mountain? Obviously, earlier in the chapter, Abraham said, me and my son, we will come down together. We'll be back. That's what is said to the two men left behind with the donkey. But after this event, you don't see Isaac again for a long time. And I find it interesting that Isaac, the son of promise, or, even could be described as the son of the covenant, he's not ever mentioned again, or seen, I should rather state again, for a little while on, for a couple more chapters. If you take a look in Genesis 24, it says that Abraham was old and he was advanced in his age. He actually sends off somebody to go find a bride for his son Isaac. And I find it kind of interesting that in the text itself, you don't find a name ever mentioned as to who this person is. But what I find also really cool is that in both Christian commentaries I have owned and I have read, and Jewish commentaries that I also own and read, even though it's not said in Scripture who this individual is in the narrative, both Christians and Jews agree that it was Eliezer. You take a look at his name and its meaning. El, as I mentioned, is one of the most simplistic names of God in the Hebrew that's used. Eli or Eliezer with El, and then in English we have that letter I. In Hebrew, that's indicative of possession. It's mine, so it's my El, or God of mine, or God is my. And then Ezer, which means help. So we have this story, and it's in Genesis 24, about how Abraham sends his servant off, this one who is the helper of God, or God's help, searching for a bride for the son. And again, I think that's something that's kind of unique, because we see Isaac, we see this sacrifice that is given, even though it's not quite what we anticipate is what it's built up to be, at least in our minds. And then after the sacrifice is performed, we don't see this son again ever mentioned. We see him mentioned, but we don't ever see him physically really again until he is being presented his bride. Whenever the father's helper is out searching for a bride, looking for the qualifications of the one who would be worthy. And I think, again, taking a look at this in Scripture, we find that something in the New Testament as well. One of the things I think we have found a fault in a lot of times in modern times is we use the Old Testament and then we use the New Testament, and outside of portions of Genesis and maybe the Psalms and some of the little historicity pieces mentioned there, it's almost treated as though the Old and New Testament are so opposed to one another. And there's a lot of these things, like I believe whenever we do that, we're losing a lot of the quality. We're missing a lot of the purpose of why these books were penned and included in the canon of Scripture. These are vital. Like I said, even Jesus said in the three facets of what would be considered to be the Hebrew Bible, where he could be found, to me, that's him laying down the challenge of, look, use these things to examine the Scriptures to prove and show that I am who I say I am. And like I said, I feel it's very important for us to take a look at all of these things together, and that's really my preachings, my teachings, and a lot of what I've done, really, especially since 2017, 2018, people like to tell me, you focus quite a bit on the Old Testament. Why is that? This is the reason. I could remember my grandmother whenever I was a little kid, she'd scratch out and write out a grocery list. And if she were to take that little sheet of paper that she had and set it beside an open window and had a gust of wind come by, take the whole thing out and the list would go out the window. But if she were to put a paperweight on it, you wouldn't have to worry about it being snatched away. You wouldn't have to worry about this being taken out and lost. And I feel like there is a need, and this is why I love doing my Bible studies the way I do. One of the reasons I feel it's important for us to be familiar with these and like sharing all of this back and forth with one another. Many of us, we have the faith, but how many people have we seen along the way who've lost their way because they haven't put the emphasis behind it? They haven't brought themselves down, Like I said, there's a lot of people who call this portion in Genesis kind of a black eye of Scripture because it sounds like this, God is asking this man to kill his son. But again, take a look at this. Take a look at what had to have been going through the individuals here. How given was Abraham to God himself? And how willing was Abraham to trust God with his promise? And again, that's something, thank God it wasn't me who was ever going through that, because that would be something difficult. That's where the aspect of the other meaning of Moriah would be for me. That would be a bitter spot. I understand that God can be seen in every single thing, but this is going to be something really bitter for me to even accept. I've even seen where, and again, this is in the Jewish commentary that I read, we see that it was Abraham waking up early in the morning with his son and a couple servants going up to this place. And the very next chapter, we see Sarah died. In the commentaries, they said the reason why Sarah died is she found out what Abraham was up to and she died of shock. Now, I'm not saying that's exactly what happened, but I see the methodology. I see the reason why this is believed. And again, a lot of my recordings may sound a little bit different from here on out just because I'm not actually preaching to a congregation in and of itself like I was at Homestead on this recording. I'm actually sitting in my living room right now. My wife is asleep in the bedroom, as is my daughter in the other room, and my son's in Little Rock visiting his grandparents. So if I sound a little bit monotone, that is a generous reason as to why I'm hoping not to awake any other household members with me talking in the living room a little too loud, being a little too enthusiastic. I believe that will be something that will get a little bit better in time. I'm preaching to more than just, a Bible and an iPad right beside me here. But again, if you were able to listen all the way through this, kudos to you. I believe you have more strength than I do, being able to hear all this stuff. But again, thank you for taking the time aside. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, or even rebuttals, I'm absolutely open and welcome to any and all of the above. I really thrive on doing a lot of research, and so if there is feedback to be given, I look forward to hearing it. Maybe there are some things that you have questions on in Scripture, or profiles, or characters that you just kind of want to see maybe what I could dig up. Always feel free to send them my way, and no promises I'll be able to do something on everything sent my way, but I absolutely love the challenge. So thank you much. God bless.